Hello everybody and welcome to my video on the Olympus Pen EES, or as we're going to call it, the Pen EES, which proves that it's not the size of your camera but how you take photos. The Olympus Pen EES is a half-frame shutter priority 35mm camera. So what that means is it takes half-frame images in shutter priority mode only on 35mm film. It has a selenium cell meter to control the aperture, so the shutter speed on this camera is fixed. This cell right here looks at how much light is in the scene and then picks out the best aperture for the scene based on the fixed shutter speed. It has a leaf shutter, and the shutter speeds on this camera are either 1/40th of a second or 1/200th of a second. So what that means is that, okay, so when I said it was a shutter priority camera, the camera will pick one of those two shutter speeds based on your light level and then pick an aperture to go with it, again based on the light level and what the meter tells the camera to do. The flash sync on this camera is only when you are using these orange dials, these orange numbers on the lens, and we'll get to those in a bit. Okay, those will trigger the flash. If you are using these numbers over here, which are film speeds, I do not think the flash will be triggered or it will not be triggered accurately with the camera. So the camera does have the ability to prevent you from taking underexposed photos. If there's enough light in a scene, it will let you take a photo. If there is not enough light in a scene, it will not let you take a photo. So that's a really nice feature that this camera offers. And one other note, this camera does have a very nice lens on it. According to the camera's manual, with a good quality film, images from this camera can be enlarged to as large a print as 16 inches by 20 inches. The Olympus Pen EES was targeted at point-and-shoot enthusiasts who liked to save money on film because it took half-frame images. These were very popular in the Japanese market, especially where smaller cameras were very in vogue for many, many years and still are to a greater extent than they are here in the US or in Europe, although they were also marketed here in the US and I believe in Europe as well. This was designed specifically to be a zone focus camera. You can focus it, but it's very, very hard to get precise focus. So what the camera does is try to give you a zone of focus where anything within that range, it'll be just fine. And it's also designed to help control costs, as I mentioned with film, because half-frame cameras cost half as much per frame as full-frame cameras. It was made by Olympus in Japan from 1962 until 1968. It was preceded by the EE and followed by the EEEL, or as it should actually be pronounced, EEL. Sorry, by the way, I really enjoy the Olympus Pen line cameras. They are just fantastic, so I enjoy having a little bit of fun with them. So as we do, let's go over the camera's features and talk about what the different things are. On the side here, we have a little clip, actually on each side, where you could put a little wrist strap. You could put a neck strap on this camera because there's two of them, but really, it's very light, doesn't need it. A wrist strap should be enough. Film rewind knob and lever for rewinding the film. Pen EE, the model, serial number, shutter release button. And then here is your frame count window, which is a manually reset frame count window. And as you might have just been able to see, it counts downward. So if you look at the number right now where it's pointing to number 8, and it'll count downward. Oops. On the front of the camera, we have the make and model Olympus Pen, and then we know it's the EES flash PC port. Lens, well this whole thing is the lens assembly. The glass in the center is the lens specs, the selenium meter. This is your focusing ring right here. And then this black dial on the outside is your aperture selection ring in flash mode, X flash mode, which is any modern flash. We'll talk about that in a little bit, to set a specific aperture. Or if you're shooting in automatic mode, to select a specific film ISO as fast as 200 and as slow as 10. This is marked for ASA. ASA and ISO are the same thing. On the back of the camera, we have the viewfinder window and the frame advance dial. On the camera's bottom, we have the film back release right here, made in Japan, tripod socket, film rewind button. To get into the camera, we simply lift up this little switch or lever, turn it 180 degrees in the direction it will turn, and now we can slide the back of the camera off, just like that. Here's the inside of the camera. Here's the film cassette chamber. These are film guide rails that help keep the film properly aligned and smooth as it runs through the camera so that it does so without binding and images are properly focused. Here's the image window right here, and you can see how small that half frame negative is, and also that by default it's portrait orientation. This is your film tension sprocket, which helps keep tension on the film as it moves through the camera. Film take-up spool. Here we have the back of the camera. This is your film pressure plate, which sandwiches the film up against these rails to keep it flat as it moves through the camera. And then this cassette retaining spring right here helps the cassette stay properly aligned inside of the camera. So one thing about this camera, it does not have a battery. The selenium cell works off of magic, so you don't ever have to worry about changing the battery in this camera. While we have the camera back open, we're going to put a new roll of film into it. We're going to grab our roll of film, put it in the cassette chamber, and pull out a little leader. Maybe if it lets me. There we go. I'm going to pull out a leader, and make sure when you're doing this, by the way, that you set the lens to any of the orange numbers, because that will let you actually trigger the shutter more easily, which will help you with loading the film. We're going to load the leader into the take-up spool like that. It's not pretty, but it should work. Now that that's around, we can take the back of the camera and put it onto the camera's back. Well, onto the camera, rather. Now we're going to set this upright, and we're going to advance a couple of frames just to get the bad film out of the way. Now let's say that we have a 36 exposure roll in here. This is a half frame camera. It can take more than 36 exposures on that roll. So we're going to set this to 72 because it takes 2 frames for every one. 72 is double 36. You can see that the 72 and the 40 are yellow, and that's because back in the day 36 and 20 exposures were the standards. So 36 turns into 72. Today you would get a 24 exposure roll, and that turns into 48. So all that you have to do is to adjust this is push down on the dial a little bit and take it to the correct marking. Each of these marks between 60 and 72, for instance, or 50 and 60, counts as 2 frames. So for a 24 exposure roll that gives you 48 frames, you just put it on the notch right before 50, and now you're set. And you can go about your day and take photos. So we're out and about taking our photos and so on and so forth. Everything's going well. Film, if you're new to it, is one and done. It can record light a single time, either in a controlled manner with a proper shutter speed and aperture, or in an uncontrolled manner where it absorbs all of the light that reaches it, or as much of the light that reaches it as it can, by doing something like this. So if you open up the back of your camera while you have film in it, all of this film that's outside of the cassette will be erased to all past and future images, because once the film emulsion absorbs light, it can't be used again. But I want you to see what's going on in the camera as you take a photo. Each time you take an image, now the image area is right about here, you press the shutter button, and then you advance the film to rearm the shutter and bring more film into the film shutter area. So that's the process of what's going on when you do that. To rewind your film when you're done, there's a button down here that you would depress on the bottom of the camera. I'm not going to put the cameras back on just to do this, but it connects with a button right here inside the camera. And then you flip out this lever, and now you can rewind the film. Now, just be sure that whenever you rewind the film that you don't take the back of the camera off until you have finished rewinding it. So now that we've rewound the film, we can take the camera back off, remove the film that we just used, grab another roll of film, load it into the camera, pull out the leader and repeat, or if we're done for the day, we don't put a roll of film in, we just put the back of the camera back on. Make sure that we trigger the shutter before we set it off to the side for the day, and we're done. All right, so before we get any further, I want to take a look at the lens and show you guys how to read the lens markings, because some of this is important to know for what we're about to talk about. Here is the actual selection dial, right? So when I said it has a 40th or a 200th of a second shutter speed, I misspoke a little bit in that with the ISO selection speeds that are in the white numbers, that will be a 200th of a second shutter speed, or at least it's supposed to always be a 200th of a second shutter speed. If your Pen EES has a dead selenium cell on it, it will not ever take a photo with the white numbers over here. This one has a dead selenium cell on it. It will only work with the orange numbers. We'll get to that in just a second. But let's say you have a working Pen EES. If you are here in the white numbers, your shutter speed is going to be 1/200th of a second, and based on the amount of light, the camera is going to... Oh, it worked there. Okay, nice. If you have a working selenium cell on this, like that suddenly magically worked, then what's going to happen is you're going to get a 200th of a second exposure with your numbers over here and a proper aperture based on your lighting. So anyway, but if you're over here in the orange numbers, these are your flash sync speeds. This is 1/40th of a second for all of these from f2.8 to f22. And what these do is control your aperture. So based on the power of your flash, for instance, you would pick, or your distance to your subject is another example, you'd pick the proper aperture, and then you would take your photo, and it would trigger the flash and give you the correct aperture. This also works, let's say you're using something like a 50 ISO film out in full sun. You could just use 1/16 f16, and you would have a limited amount of manual exposure control in the event that your selenium cell has failed. So basically, if you have a failed camera, you're going to get a 1/40th of a second aperture or shutter priority camera, and you can control the aperture and use your film selection to get some exposure control there. So that's how this dial works. This dial right here is your focusing dial, and I'm going to go all the way back out to infinity. You can see there that there is a mountain symbol, right, at the focus point. If we bring those three people up to the center, now we are focused closer at a distance that we would use for a group shot. If we bring it even closer, now we have a single person symbol, and we are focused at a point that would be appropriate for a portrait shot. And then there's a little bit of room to go on the closer side as well. Why is it, however, for those of you eagle-eyed who notice this, that the group shot is red? This is your zone focus point. And what that means is that in general, if you are out in full sun, let's say, and you're using something like a 100 or 200 ISO film, you can set your focus point there and completely forget it. With a fast enough film and full sun, your shutter speed is going to give you a deep enough depth of field with the aperture that's selected to have everything be in suitable focus. So if you just left your lens here and used a 100 to 200 ISO film, you'd get a lot out of this camera. Now, some more details about this. At the mountain indicator, there is supposed to be a detent at the mountain. I can't perceive a detent with this lens, but when you have this set to the mountain, what you're going to get in focus is everything from about 50 feet in front of you to infinity. With the red group of people, everything here is focused at about 3 meters. And with the single person focus point, too far, there we go, what you get is a focus point that is about 1/2 of a meter. Now, if your lens does have the detents that this is supposed to have, but for whatever reason mine doesn't, if you have the manual, PDF page 18 has a depth of field table for focus detent settings and aperture settings for each of the different detents that this has, which I think are either the specific settings or maybe the little dots next to them. I'm not quite sure. So I don't have those memorized or written down, but they are in the manual. So the next thing that we're going to do is talk about how to use a flash with this camera. Okay, there's no hot shoe on the camera, so you cannot mount a flash to it. What you can do is use this PC port to connect a flash PC cable to your flash. I don't have one of those to demonstrate with. Now what you can do is hold the camera in one hand and the flash in the other and point it wherever you need to point it to get your best lighting. Your worst lighting is having the flash something like this or like this, where the light from the flash leaves the flash, reaches your subject, bounces back to your lens in a very flat manner, which will make your subject look very flat, very waxy. What you want to try to do with a flash is mimic natural or man-made lighting, which is to say overhead. The sun is above us. The lights in our offices or the streets at night are above us. So we see and our brain perceives something lit from above as being natural and normal. So that's what you want to try to do with your flash, is point it up at the ceiling, or if you don't have a ceiling, then a wall or at a reflector, something that will cause the light to go up from the flash down to your subject and back to your lens, and that's going to give you the most natural lighting. So the next thing we're going to do is talk about how to take a photo with this camera. It's pretty easy. If you are going to shoot in automatic mode, you just load your film and then you select the detent for the film speed that is closest to your film speed, which I think this is all of them. It is. It's like a 10, 15, 20, 32, 40, 50, 64, 80, 100, 160, we're missing 125, and 200. So if you're shooting a 125 film like FP4 Plus, just set it to 100 ISO, you're going to be close enough. So, and then you're just going to get your automatic shutter speed and the camera will pick the best aperture for you. If you're going to be shooting a flash, like we just talked about how to do it, you want to manually select your aperture based on the power, the amount of light that you need on your film and the power of your flash and the distance to your subject. Calculating that is beyond the scope of this video, but it is a thing that you would need to do to use a flash with this camera. Now, to take a picture, all you have to do is figure out your approximate focus point and pick between the three primary focus areas. Look through the viewfinder, sight up your scene, take your picture. That's it in advance. It's designed to be very simple to use, and it is very simple to use. So what about double exposures? You can't, not with this camera. It has double exposure prevention built in, so you cannot accidentally or intentionally take a double exposure with this. I mean, you could hold the rewind button down and crank this backwards. These are not meant for double exposure, so doing that would absolutely mess up your double exposure and probably at least one frame after it. Some tips for using the Pen EES. The manual suggests waiting until you're ready to take your next photo to advance the film. So after you take your photo, don't immediately advance the film just like that. After you take your photo, you want to wait, and then when you're about to take your next photo, you advance the film. The reason is that it preserves the shutter's mechanical components to hold off on advancing the film. And that, namely, is preserving the springs which are responsible for shutter timing. So ignore what I said earlier about only getting 1/200th of a second with these right here. The shutter speed is based on the EV. From EV 8 to 11, the camera will automatically pick f2.8 to f8 when you're in an automatic mode like this, and give you 1/40th of a second. For EV 11 only, it might use 1/200th of a second and f2.8, or 1/40th and something else. For EV 12 to 16, it will use 1/200th of a second and f4 to f22. The more light you have, the more likely you are to get 1/200th of a second, and the less light you have, the more likely you are to get 1/40th of a second. So some things not to do with this camera. Don't store the camera with the shutter armed. Anytime you're done with it for the day, trip the shutter just to make sure, even if it costs you half a frame, it's better and cheaper to waste half a frame than to have your camera repaired. Don't leave your camera in your car because the heat and the cold can affect the lubricating oils, which will affect shutter timing, can also result in your car being broken into and having your camera stolen. Don't keep it in a plastic bag or box unless you have a very good and rechargeable desiccant pack that you keep recharged, because mildew will ruin your camera. And one last thing, just remember that your Olympus Pen EES is a precision tool that should be handled with care and respect. And as long as you take care of your camera will take care of you. Thank you for watching this video. Please give me a thumbs up. That lets me know that I'm on the right track producing content which is useful and helpful to you. If you have any questions or comments, please leave those in the comments section below. I'm pretty good about checking these every couple of days and answering questions. If you have any suggestions or ideas for future videos, and if I have the technical know-how and equipment, I'm more than happy to make those. One last thing. Thank you everyone for watching, and I'll see you in the next video. I gotta get up, Steinbeck. I have to turn off the camera.